one thing I noticed about when they were talking, they don't like each other. This Marshall and Richard.
Yeah, I think that that's pretty clear. I mean, I think that he is not very liked by quite a number of scholars in the field, actually, like Hector Avalos and Matthew Ferguson, and even people like John Loftus and stuff like that. They've all kind of had run-ins with him and had to deal with like responses from him that mischaracterize them, which can be frustrating. I
Yeah.
know that Matthew Ferguson in particular has Matthew Ferguson is um, he's a PhD graduate student in California, I think Irvine, and he has had a couple of exchanges with Marshall through their respective blogs, and yeah, there seems to be a pattern going on, and I mean, I don't like to call people dishonest, but there is a bit of a pattern there of at least him saying things about them that misrepresents them.
So anybody listening on the live stream, Cam and I just thought we'd hang out tonight and talk about. Is this a podcast or a Christian? It's Premier Christian Radio. Richard Carrier today, just hours ago, was talking to David Marshall about mythicism of Jesus, whether Jesus was a myth or not. And of course, Richard Carrier says, yes, Jesus is a myth, or the probabilities say that he was. And David Marshall basically say, no, of course not. Jesus is definitely a real person and said the things he said in the Gospels. And this is history written down in Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. And one thing I noticed just listening to it, first of all, the guy who the interviewer, the mediator, he was quite good.
Yeah, he was. I think his name is Justin Braley. Yeah, he's really good at sort of moderating the discussion.
Yeah, because I couldn't tell I literally could not tell if he was a theist, an atheist, whose side he was on. He was very down the middle of the road, adjudicating and keeping things on point. And he was very good at summarizing both sides. So, yeah, my overall thoughts on it was these two guys hate each other. So if you guys want to listen to it for yourself, you can actually just feel the vitriol coming through the radio waves. And I'll post a link later. And I guess from Richard Carrier's point of view, David Marshall misrepresents him all the time and basically says, look, no one takes you seriously, Richard Carrier. You don't think Jesus actually existed, so no, you're just a goofball. And Richard Carrier's point back to Marshall is, you're not seriously taking my arguments, my evidence, the things I'm saying seriously. You're not even reading my books. You're not even understanding what I'm saying. Everything I'm talking about has been peer reviewed, and so it's
yeah.
Go ahead.
I think one of the strongest things Carrier said was less about his book being peer reviewed and maybe less about whether or not Marshall has properly read Carrier's books, Proving History and On the Historicity of Jesus, but more that Marshall seems to show a real lack of familiarity with the other peer-reviewed work which is relevant to the case he's trying to make. For example, it sort of feels like he just goes blundering into the discussion about mystery religions without even really having any knowledge of, like why the criteria that Carrier thinks are relevant are also considered relevant by experts in mystery religions. It's quite strange. I either sort of came away from it wondering if Marshall either hadn't read the appropriate stuff or was deliberately lying about it. Like, I mean, the idea that he hasn't read it is, that almost saves him a bit, But if he has read it, then it seems like he's being, just completely deceitful about it.
One of the arguments that Marshall made on this radio podcast was something I hear often from Muslims, is that the Gospels don't read like myth. This is Marshall speaking. The Gospels don't read like myth. They read like this actually happened in history, and it's so unique compared to like anybody who just sits down, reads the Gospels for themselves, will very quickly understand that this Jesus guy was a unique figure in history, said things that no one else said, and it was almost an emotional appeal that you can just feel that this is true. Did you get that sense from Marshall that that was his core argument?
It's not only a sense of feeling. My understanding is that of the 30 or so, I think it was up to 50 at one point, but of the 30 or so criteria he outlines in his book, which was part of the subject of this interview, this radio interview. Of those criteria, many of them actually have that element to them. They are, focusing on unique and compelling aspects about the Christian message and how Jesus perfectly plays into the belief in Christianity of the time in terms of how he, the position that he puts forward in the Gospels.
What I typically hear from Christians is, what's interesting, I hear two different versions. I've talked to Christians who say, yes, of course, Doug, there's similarities between Jesus and the myths. Like God wouldn't take something foreign and introduce something foreign to a culture, to a people that they would immediately reject. So of course you're going to find similarities between Jesus and other myths. I've heard Christians say that. In fact, even C.S. Lewis admits to that when, I forget who he was talking to, but basically saying that, Jesus was similar to other myths of the time, but he was the true myth. He was the fulfillment of all the other myths. And but then I've talked to other Christians who say, no. The other myth stories in history are nowhere near similar to Christianity. They're just completely different, Doug. So I've heard both extremes. But Carrier's point is that you're not looking, when you're talking about similarities between Jesus and other figures in history who most Christians would say are myth, we're not talking about the purpose and the details of each story. We're talking about how they were constructed is similar. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think the methods by, like the evidence of the methods that are used to construct the stories is what is, one of the most striking parallels between so here's a bit of an explanation of what myth is. And it's not like a, canonical explanation. It's not like, not necessarily the only perspective, but myth seems to be a category that actually spans genres. So one in biblical studies, one thing which has been a frequently studied and written about thing is what is the genre of the Gospels, with the idea that if we can identify what genre they belong to, it'll give us some information about whether or not they're historically reliable. Now, that effort makes part of the mistake of presupposing that falsehood can only exist within one type of genre. But the reality is instead that we find like markers of myth across many different genres in the ancient world. It's not exactly that like myth was isolated to one particular genre. So like it's not, we have historical biographies which are myth. In fact, historical biographies that are about euhemerize, deities. We have myth in romance novels. We have myth in stuff that is like outright fiction. We have the same kind of markers. And one thing that you can identify that helps to identify myth is really unnatural coincidences within stories that play a literary role. So they play like a core, they play into like a core element of the story. Another one is like historical implausibilities. This can be either events that occur that are implausible, like, in the Gospels, a good example would be the whole world darkness that occurs, or maybe implausibilities in how people act and behave. And we use these kind of elements in texts like Gospels to get a better idea about how the authors are composing them, whether or not they're composing them to tell a truth about like a symbolic truth, or whether or not they're actually reporting history. Other markers of myth are whether or not a historian, or sorry, whether or not an author makes any effort to deal with their sources. So do they identify their sources? Do they name them, or
Well,
do they
I got a list, so I made notes. So this is what most, if not all, ancient historians, the criteria they use to determine whether something is a myth or not. Number one, they don't name their sources. They don't criticize their sources. In other words, here's two sources I could have used. I chose this one over another one. They don't, sift through their sources. They don't compare or contrast one source with another source. They contain fabulous events, like miracle stories. They contain a storyline that leads to a climax that is built within the story narrative from beginning to end. They promote a religious belief with a central hero. And the story is told as if true. And they don't use the structure of telling of history as used in that time. In other words, it's different than a historical text that of that time you could compare. So those are, what did I say, 3, 4, 5, 6, probably 6 or 7 different criteria. And so what Richard Carrier is saying is that, look, the Gospels are anonymous. They don't name their sources. They don't criticize any other source.
even when we know for a fact they were using sources, like in the case of Matthew, we know Matthew was using Mark, and same with Luke. We have good reason to suspect Luke was actually using both Mark and Matthew, but yet doesn't acknowledge this.
Yeah, and that's one thing that I never knew when I was a Christian is, odds are the author of Matthew had Mark right in front of him opened while he was writing Matthew.
And it's not just low odds, or say just over 50% or something like that. I mean, it's very difficult to explain the content of Matthew without the hypothesis that he is copying directly from Mark.
And so the Gospels they're anonymous, they don't name their sources. Of course, Christians say, well, the source is God. But they don't claim to be eyewitness accounts. In fact, Cam and I were talking about this the other day of compiling a list of Christian historians who they themselves say that the Gospels are not eyewitness accounts. We're working on that. I would love to have a website where Christians could go and see Christian historians. We're not talking about those evil secular historians. We're talking about true Christian historians who they themselves say, no, I'm sorry, my fellow Christian friends, I don't think these are eyewitness accounts. And so because they're not going to listen to Cam, and they're not going to listen to us. We're fallen, dark side creatures, but they might listen. They might listen to a Christian historian who says, "No, they're not written by eyewitnesses." And then the Gospels do contain fabulous events. So I want to try a little experiment here. Gandhi. Gandhi's a great person to use. So I'm going to put up a picture of Gandhi, and I want you to focus in on his picture. And then I'm going to read something. So I want you to listen to what I'm going to read and picture Gandhi either saying it or doing it. Let's see. So the sky tears open, and a magical voice booms, and Gandhi hears it from heaven. And angels bring Gandhi food. Gandhi flies through the air with Satan and observes the whole world from a mountaintop. Gandhi withers a fig tree out of season. Gandhi drowns 2,000 pigs by casting spirits into them. And Gandhi convinces several people to abandon their careers and families and follow him as disciples after showing up out of nowhere, doing nothing and uttering just a couple sentences. Gandhi clears a busy temple single-handedly without any weapons and without anyone laying a finger on him. Because of
a huge temple, I might add.
Yeah. Because of Gandhi, the sun goes out for 3 hours. And because of Gandhi, an 80-foot temple curtain magically tears completely in two. And because of Gandhi, hordes of dead people come out of the tombs and start walking around Jerusalem. Gandhi has many conversations with demons. Gandhi walks on water. Gandhi commands the weather. And Gandhi magically conjures hundreds of fish and loaves of bread. Gandhi also heals amputated ears. Now, Christians, if you're hearing this, and if this all was written down in a book about Gandhi, would you believe it? Would you just automatically say, "Hey, yeah, this could be historical"? Yeah, let's look into this more. Like maybe Gandhi did all these things. Would your default position be that what I just said about Gandhi is true? Or would you say, okay, maybe it's true, but I doubt it. Maybe it could be true, but it sure sounds pretty fairy tale-ish to me. And I think this is what a lot of Christians miss, is that just by putting up the picture of Gandhi here, focusing on Gandhi's face, and then attributing all these things to Gandhi, it's very easy for the Christian to say, oh yeah, I would question that if I read that about Gandhi. But now change that picture to Jesus, the European Jesus that everybody sees. Then it becomes, oh yeah, very historical, very possibly true. I don't know. Do you think that will have any impact, Cam?
I don't know. I don't think so. It's a good thought experiment, though.
Yeah, well, if any Christian watches this later, I'd be interested to know what they think of what I just did.
Yeah, so something that came up in the debate or discussion between Carrier and Marshall was the idea of a naturalistic bias of historians, and this idea that the only reason for the rejection of miraculous stories in the Gospels is through a philosophical bias that scholars like Carrier and Ehrman have against these miracle stories. And that they have no justified reason in not being compelled to believe them other than their naturalistic bias. Now, you've probably heard this come up a number of times. They didn't really address it in the discussion because it brings a whole bunch of other issues to the table that would have consumed more of the radio show than the host obviously wanted. But it's something I've heard lots of times, and I think it's a really unfounded charge. What do you think about that, Doug?
I think we are rabid materialist fundamentalists. That's what James White called me. I think what I just did with Gandhi kind of speaks to that. It's if you can just for a second take your world belief, your worldview, and shelve it, just stick it in a shelf, and then observe the texts like for what it is, for what we have. If you knew nothing about Christianity, if you could wipe your brain clear of Christianity and just read the Gospels for the first time, even if you believe in God, you could still believe in a God or gods. But if you just read the Gospels for the very first time, like you'd never heard it at all, I don't think you would say automatically, oh, yeah, this happened in history. So I think if whether you're an atheist or a Christian or whatever, if you just can, what's the line, a veil of ignorance, approach it from a veil of ignorance and just read it for what it is. I think the point that Carrier is making with myths contain fabulous events, I think if you can have that veil of ignorance, I think it's very easy to see that there's fabulous events in the Gospels that you would not assume are historical.
And it's not so much, we're often charged with not allowing for the possibility of miracle. And in my worldview, that's not the case. I mean, I'm primarily concerned with what evidence there is for such propositions, not a dogmatic commitment to some kind of metaphysics. And so if there were compelling evidence for, a miracle claim, I would believe it. The difficulty is that simply a claim in a text generally can't meet the kind of requirements of evidence that miracles must have in order to overcome the general fact that they don't usually occur. People don't usually rise from the dead after 3 days. People don't usually rise out of their graves and walk around the streets, and those aren't typical occurrences. They are rare, extremely rare, or have never occurred.
I gotta correct someone in the chat here. Ocean, we're not talking about whether Jesus is historic or not. We're talking about the myth of Christianity right now, which is related.
Yeah.
But we're not here. And this discussion between Carrier and Marshall that happened this afternoon was not whether Jesus existed or not. It's whether,
part of it was meant to be that, but it
Yeah.
ended up being more of a discussion about whether or not myth exists in the Gospels.
Right. So that was the bigger point to be made. So
Yes.
there very well could have been a guy named Jesus, but still Christianity could still have been legendized or mythicized or parts of it.
Yeah. So, yeah, Ocean is right. That is the title, but the content of the debate ended up being mostly about whether or not the Gospels contain myth about Jesus. And the reason for that is because Marshall actually claims that effectively all of the stories about Jesus in the Gospel are true. And so he's on like a very, very like Christian side of the fence with that, and not very engaged with the types of things that secular historians are discussing. Now, so my personal opinion on it is that the Gospels pretty much like aren't evidence for or against Jesus having existed. I think that they could exist as they are, whether he did or not. I think what's more interesting is to look at the epistles, and in particular the epistles of Paul, and other facts that are relevant to the background of the origins of Christianity. Yeah.
So there's a lot of errors that people bandy about on Jesus is similar to such and such, like Mithras, or what are some other ones? Horus
is one that people claim, but those parallels are generally overblown. But there are relevant parallels, like there were.
But those are the bad ones.
Yeah, those are the bad ones, and those are the ones that good historians should make an effort to distance themselves from.
But let's talk about the good ones, the ones that are have more parallels, and this is the problem I'm just going to state the objection to it outright from Christians that I've heard, is that, oh yeah, there's some similarities, Doug, but there's vast differences, so you can't say that, you can't use them. And noted that there are differences between the other rising and dying gods, but that would be expected. You would expect different religions to have differences. But the point is, and the point that I think Carrier is making, is that the Jews came late to the game. They were way behind the curve when it came to the rising and dying God concept. And Carrier's point is he uses four main ones, starting with the Sumerian about 1,500 years before Jesus. The Sumerian goddess, how do you pronounce it? Inanna. So now get this. She died. She went into some version of hell, was killed there for 3 days. This is found on Egyptian Sumerian tablets, and then came back to life. Dionysus is the Greek god, the Greek version of a dying rising god. Osiris is the Egyptian, is another Egyptian god. Well, no, the first Egyptian god, dying and rising. Inanna was a Sumerian, and Adonis is another one. So the whole concept of
Adonis,
yeah, that's one Richard Carrier mentions, Assyrian Turk type god. So we have this pattern throughout history, going from about 2000 BC or 1500 BC all the way up to 600 BC of these either gods or demigods going through some type of struggle, dying, and then coming back to life for some purpose. And usually the purpose was for some type of greater good for whoever believed in these gods. It wasn't in vain. It wasn't just for kicks and giggles.
Victory over death in some kind of manner.
Yeah.
But so,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, they often, not all, but one of the other common features is that they go through some kind of a passion or a struggle.
Yeah. So
the difficulty here, though, is that I think a lot of Christians would they'd go away and they would look to the primary evidence about, well, maybe they wouldn't even do that, but they'd go and read something at least about these figures, and they very quickly fall prey to I don't know quite what to describe it as, but it's like a fallacy of uniqueness. It's this idea that because they have differences, they're no longer relevant parallels to each other. But the thing is that within syncretism, the syncretistic practices and cultural diffusion that we know has produced many religions, we don't expect there to be the exact carbon copy clone from religion to religion. They're often formed out of unconsciously through cultural diffusion out of existing gods and existing ideas and existing practices within their local religion. And one of Carrier's points is that, this is no different for Christianity. It's very much a combination of very Jewish ideas and Hellenistic ideas. And it's not expected to be exactly the same as God's worship before Jesus Christ. Instead, it has its own unique differences, but it shares commonalities too.
Yeah. Something else Carrier said was some similarities between these other gods and Jesus was this concept of baptism, some type of washing, and not only for the living, but for the dead. And a lot of Christians don't realize this, but baptism of the dead is in the, where is it? It's in Paul's letters or in the Gospels? Paul's letters. There's reference to the baptism for the dead. And all these type dying, rising gods have this mystery about them, like almost like it's an irony of not understanding something, but there's a greater good to come. Sacred meals. There's often some ritual having to do with food. That's another thing that
which isn't surprising at all.
Well, no, it's very natural, right? It's
when you're congregating, people eat. Like it's just sort of, and so those things. But it's more that the meal is of some kind of important symbolic.
Right, but the whole concept of communion in Christianity is not unique. In other words, in that sense. And then what you've already said, that these saviors are usually a son or daughter of a god. They all undergo some sort of suffering. The suffering leads to victory and death, and then that death leads to some type of salvation. Now, it might not be in a heaven type salvation, but some type of good thing that will happen to them.
And sometimes it is like some kind of heaven or resurrection. Just it might have different conceptual trappings, but a commonality.
Well, what baffles me now is looking at the Gospels now as a non-believer. It just seems so clear, but to the believer, it just seems so ludicrous of how, like, I can see writings in the Old Testament used to actually create the New Testament without much or any of it actually happening. And for the Christian to hear that, they're just like, how stupid and ludicrous is that comment, Doug? Like, this is history unfolding, and it was fulfilled prophecy and all these things. But yet you can just read for yourself these prophecies in the Old Testament and find them in the New Testament. And some of them are just wrong. I mean, they got the prophecy wrong. Like, for example, the one donkey or two donkeys, one colt or two colts riding into Jerusalem. I think, is it Matthew and Luke mix it up?
Matthew has two. Mark had one.
Yeah. And so that you can tell the authors misinterpreted or had a difference in the interpretation of Zechariah 9:9. And you can read things in the Psalms. Is it Psalm 22, 23? That is found exactly word for word in Mark. And so it doesn't take much of an imagination to say that the Old Testament was basically I wouldn't call it a prequel, but it was the screenplay basis for the new screenplay, the Gospels.
Yeah. Ocean made mention of the fact in the comments about how Osiris is reassembled by, is it Isis, I think? And he doesn't come back to life. But here's the thing, though, is that, like, yes, some accounts of Osiris have that claim, but my understanding, and I have to admit that I haven't actually read the primary source, but my understanding is that there is that there were, and this is prior to Christianity, multiple Osiris cults, and some Osiris cults actually believed that Osiris did come back to life, not just was simply reassembled in some kind of hobbled together fashion.
Yeah, and I think he got a gold penis, if I remember correctly, a golden penis.
Yeah, because I mean, this goes back to again as well that like we don't sometimes atheistic scholars or like just internet bloggers or whatever will make more of the parallels than what there really are, in that they'll say that they are like exactly the same or things like this, but that isn't really required. Like there's no point in stretching the evidence to say that it's something that it isn't. Like it's not the claim that the conception of resurrection among these different religions was identical. And sometimes there have been some like pretty in-depth scholarly works where they restrict the definition of resurrection so tightly that they then point to the evidence and go, hey, look, there is no parallel between the concept of resurrection as found in the Gospels and the concept of resurrection elsewhere found in the ancient milieu. Instead, but without realizing that like they're almost arbitrarily restricting the definition, which I think is irrational.
I try to figure the most common sense way to explain why I think even the concept of the Gospels being written by eyewitnesses describing history is kind of a low probability event. And this is an actual peer-reviewed, what do you call it? What the insurance companies use. Basically life expectancy based on third world today. So the guess is that people didn't live as long as the third world today, but even if you assume that they did, any gospel writer who was near the age of Jesus, who was around Jesus at that time, to live to the age of 65, which is the first gospel, 65 AD at the earliest, 17% chance that they'd be alive. So now you have a problem on your hands. That's Mark. Whoever wrote Mark has a 17% chance to even be alive at that time, to write Mark. Now, we're not even talking about Matthew, Luke, and John. John is like 80, 85 years after the fact at best. That's like a 1.5% chance to even be alive if John was an eyewitness and actually wrote John. So you take the fact that the low probability of even being alive, combine that with the fact that the literacy rate at that time was far below 10%. So now you're looking at the probability of being alive and being literate. Just based on those two facts alone, you wouldn't have to know anything else. You're looking like a 1 in 100 chance that these were written by eyewitnesses. Like 10% times 10%.
Yeah.
But
although, I mean, I think that, I mean, I don't want to appeal to authority, but the reality is within New Testament or, historical scholarship, there's a pretty darn strong consensus that none of the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses. Like, that's not a controversial conclusion. It's only really debated it's only really debated among fundamentalists. So, like, and I mean, it's good to show the logic as to why it's unlikely. I mean,
well,
leaving aside the fact that none of them claim to be written by eyewitnesses and they're all anonymous, but
and I guess
they're all derivative. Well, everyone but Mark is derivative of the other. So, but
I guess most people in the chat listening to this would say, "Well, obviously, Doug, that it's an obvious point." But I am speaking, I guess, to the fundamentalists when I say that, and I'm trying to think of new ways to show, just common sense wise, why it's such a low probability that this was even written by who they think it was. And I don't know if it has any impact on them or not. But I tell you, just if I can raise doubt that the authors are who they think they are, just by bringing up life expectancy and literacy rates, maybe they will start questioning other things. Hopefully.
Yeah.
But
although it is an additional point there is Christians, from my understanding, don't believe that Mark was an eyewitness or even meant to have been an eyewitness. That's my understanding. Wasn't he like a companion of Peter or something like that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Somebody just claimed none of the apostles spoke Greek.
That's Paul.
Well, if you are a Christian, that's kind of an odd claim.
He's not
because, okay, right. Paul was an apostle, spoke Greek, and if you believe that Peter wrote Peter, like First Peter, for example, then Peter also spoke Greek. I mean, I personally think that the apostles weren't eyewitnesses because I don't think that Jesus actually had a ministry. I think that people conflate the concept of apostles as discussed in the Pauline epistles. They conflate that with the word disciple. And I actually think that the apostles did know Greek. I think that they were Hellenized Jews.
What do you think of the argument that Marshall made that, I'm not sure, I forget if he made it today or if it was a previous time, that the miracles in the Gospels just seem more plausible than miracles you read in other ancient texts? That how did he put it? That they're more realistic miracles, whatever that means. Have you ever heard that one?
Well, I mean, if we charitably set aside the possible bias he might have, given that he's a Christian, like in assessing, the relative merits of these miracle accounts, maybe, but like the difficulty that Christians have is this conjunction, the conjunction of probabilities, the idea of adding more details onto a story intuitively can make the story seem more compelling, because it lines up more with the way that reality really works, and that there's always multiple details to an event. But when it comes to storytelling and when it comes to writing things down, the more details that you add about a story, the lower the probability of the whole thing being true through the conjunction of probabilities. And this is something that Christians in particular don't seem to understand about their ludicrous claim that the Gospels are inerrant. Like, they don't seem to realize that the more details they add, the less probable the inerrancy claim is. Like, the fact that the Bible is so large is a large problem for them. Yeah. Even if we were like extremely generous and assume that the probability of every story, or each individual story in the Bible being true is like 99%, when you multiply all of those 99% together, you get a vanishingly small number.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to try to state facts. So if you think I'm not stating a fact, let me know. But throughout history, before Jesus, there was breeding between men and gods. There's precedent for gods having coitus with humans and producing either godly children, god sons, god daughters, or demigods. That's a fact.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
So Jesus coming from a virgin mother and being conceived from the Holy Spirit, not unheard of. There's nothing new there.
Yeah, although they don't claim that there was really coitus, right? they kind of steer, like, because that's one of the products of modern, or sorry, I mean, I don't mean to say like actual modern. I mean like the Judaism that comes out of history. They tend to completely shy away from the anthropomorphization of Yahweh. So where once Yahweh was depicted as a person who could walk with Adam in the Garden of Eden and, have a struggle with Isaac or whoever it was, and, do these kind of things, or, who was it? His bum was seen or something like that in one of the early stories. As a figure, he moves to like way less anthropomorphization. And so they didn't like to think of God as like coming down and fucking Mary.
Can you imagine if Joseph was in the room next door and he's like hearing this? Keep it down, God. I'll edit that out later so the Christians can watch this. Okay, so I just want to give some basic facts. So this whole concept of the gods and people breeding, not unheard of. Before Jesus.
Sorry, I just interrupt you here, but I do want to directly make a comment towards Ocean. Like, Ocean, I'm not quite sure if I understand the logic you're using, but you do realize that we expect there to be unique elements within Christianity, and like simply because there might be some kind of novel introduction in the religion doesn't make it more plausible. Like it's not as if like something happening for the first time or a story being told about something happening for the first time makes it more likely. It makes it less likely because we have less evidence of it occurring in the past. Like it's a problem for Christianity.
And the Christians I talk to have conceded that point. I'll often ask them, they'll say Christianity is the only religion or only belief system that does X, fill in the blank for X. And then I will say, well, does that necessarily make it true? And the intelligent Christians will realize they can't say yes to that, because then other uniquenesses in other religions would possibly be true as well if uniqueness was a criteria for truth. So I think very few people will say uniqueness makes something true or makes it more likely to be true.
Ocean clarified he wasn't saying that, and so sorry if I implied that you were. I was just more trying to clarify to make sure that you weren't saying that, but it's good to hear that you didn't.
So I want to kind of wrap this up in a bow as far as the whole Jesus, from the Christian perspective. No, Doug, Jesus is not a myth. I just want to state some facts for the record here. We have precedent before Jesus that God's bred with humans. Fun fact. We have precedent in history that these gods that were the result of the breeding of other gods and men or women went through some type of struggle, some type of suffering, and either came back to life or came back as another version of themselves or whatever.
And sometimes they do that on their own, or sometimes they do that with the help of their posse. Right.
So I'm breaking it down this way because I want to eliminate, well, Doug, these other myths are nowhere like Christianity. But so far, we're 2 for 2 here with the fact that breeding, breeding is the wrong word, immaculate conception of some sort, or just, some type of interaction between gods and humans to produce another god or demigod. And then that these gods go under...
Also not God.
Yeah. And then these gods go under some type of struggle and they overcome it. That's called a passion. And that's what Jesus had to suffer in order to give people salvation. Same thing. And so that's fun fact number 2. Fun fact number 3 is it started about, at least, it could be 2,000 years before Jesus with the Sumerians. The Egyptians had their versions of this. The Greeks, the Syrians, they all had their gods that had these 2 parts that I just mentioned. The Jews were late to the party on this, and they needed their own version of this God coming down to humanity and going through a passion.
Well, that's not how I would phrase it. I wouldn't say that they needed it. I would more say that with the fact that there was diversity in Jewish belief in the first century, it becomes unsurprising that, such a syncretism would occur. Yeah. Like, it's like a natural combination, and we have examples of the syncretism occurring among other religions.
Now, so now that we've set all that precedent, it's not surprising that Christianity was an offshoot of Judaism, and that at that time, first century, it's not surprising that it happened then. And because of the prophecies in Daniel, there were Jews at the time looking for the Messiah, capital M Messiah, this type of Savior God.
As Josephus indirectly documents.
Right. So now we have all the precedents set through other religions for this type of thing to happen. We have Daniel predicting when it would happen. So now we have people looking around for this to happen.
Well, a certain interpretation.
Yeah, there's Jews. The hardcore Orthodox Jews don't believe that Daniel 9 is talking about a Messiah, even, but with the capital M.
And the secular scholars think that the prediction had already occurred.
Right, exactly. So we now have the precedent, we now have the timing, and so I personally believe, and this is where I could be wrong, but I think that the writers of the Gospels put all those things together and made a passion play narrative. Now, here's what I'm uncertain about, whether it was actually based on a true charismatic guy that existed in history, that the story was based off of, or if it was basically all conjured up from, not conjured is the wrong word, but all based on the Old Testament and some Greek mythology, the Hellenization of the time. That I'm not clear about. I think I'm probably 55, 60% believe that it is based on a real guy. And I think, Cam, I asked you this question, and I think you're probably 35, 40% that it's not.
Yeah, maybe 50. I'm pretty. I mean, I would describe myself as agnostic. I personally don't think that the evidence bears out either case.
Yeah. So it's
And I think that there's a severe like failing in historical method when trying to assess something on such what I consider compromised and poor evidence. One of the difficulties of assessing origins of Christianity is that we have a sect of Christianity that won out in what was effectively a competition between different versions of early Christianity. And the sect that won out really only preserved its own documentation. And in fact, we even have direct evidence that they expunged documentation that was against them or considered heresy. And this is, well documented in, books by Bart Ehrman, but also other scholars. So you could read Lost Christianities would be a good one to start with. So we have this kind of filtration effect where the evidence that survives for early Christianity just isn't really that great.
But Cam is the guy who gave me this great question to ask in my Durban video part 2. And the question is this for Christians. What would you expect the world to look like if what we're saying is true and that the Gospels are mostly fiction, at least, and that this guy named Jesus did not rise from the dead? What do you expect the world to look like? And that's a question I think we want Christians to really think about. Because if your answer is quick, odds are you're not thinking about it. Because I think the knee-jerk reaction Christians might have is, well, Christianity would not exist if Jesus did not rise from the dead. But really think about it and apply that question to other religions that you disagree with. And I think it becomes apparent that even if the story was false, I'm talking to the Christians now, even if Jesus did not rise from the dead, there is a very good chance Christianity would look no different today